Well, good evening. Do I need to move this or? Okay, all right. Well, it's good to see all of you here tonight. Thank you, Adam. We're in the book of Daniel, and I get excited in studying this book because I find it to be so interesting. Of course, as we've been reading the book, we see the book of Daniel came at a very difficult time for the children of Israel. We have these faithful remnant that have been taken to Babylon and put in captivity and made slaves there to serve the emperor, the king of Babylon. In the first chapter, we see they were trained to be Babylonians. And there was an attempt in the first chapter, some of the things they were doing, the attempt to change them from being Israelites or servants of God, to being servants of the king's gods of Babylon. And I think we can conclude that based upon the statement that Daniel said, he would not allow these things to defile him, which would have had polluted his relationship with God. So the first thing we see in the book of Daniel is there's this attempt to take people and convert them from being Hebrews, children of God, to being followers of the Babylonian gods and the Babylonian Empire. Now, when we get into the second chapter, and we spent 2 weeks over in the second chapter, and I just want to mention a couple of things about the second chapter before we go into the third chapter. In the second chapter, we have this big dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But this, to me, the second chapter is layered with two sets of ideas. One is the dream he has and his interaction with the wise men, finally his interaction with Daniel. And I think that answers two questions. One is, who is the ruler, really? Is Nebuchadnezzar the ruler? Because Nebuchadnezzar is demanding all of this, and they can't deliver it to him. And the second, and so we see that he's not the ruler because he can't get what he wants. The second thing is, who are the wise people? Well, all of his wise people that were trained in chapter 1, aside from Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they're not wise. We needed them bad here in the second chapter, and they can't answer any of the questions. The wise ones are the ones who did what? They stopped and what's the first thing they did? They prayed to God, and Daniel says, it's not because of me, it's because God wanted you to know. And so the wise one, the real ruler is God, because he can answer questions and he can control things. And the real wise one is God, and he shares his wisdom with us. That's the first thing of the second chapter. No, the second thing of this chapter, what we often focus on the dream because we think that's what it's all about. Well, that's a part of what it's about. The dream is an answer to Nebuchadnezzar's question. His question, he's laying awake in his bed at night, and here he is sitting on top of the world. He's ruler of the world, and he's probably wondering, how long is this going to last? And that's usually what we wonder when good times are coming, because he's just seen the Assyrians destroyed. He helped destroy the Assyrian army. And so he's wondering how long this is going to last. And we're pretty sure that is because of the interpretation of the dream. Daniel says you were looking to the future and God's giving you an answer. Now, the dream itself was this monumental image, statue that has 5 parts. The head of gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, and then the iron and clay in the feet. And we understood from study of that last week that this image represents the empires of the world. And we have the empires of the world, just like we're going to see in tonight's lesson. The empires of the world try to control everything. They try to control life. They can try to control your allegiance. They try to unite people underneath their power. And we saw last week that the empires of the world can be frightening, they can be mighty, and they can be terrible. And that's what he perceived in the dream. And, you know, if we sit, and this is a good time for us to think about that. Do we have frightening empires in the world today? If you're living in Ukraine, is there a frightening empire that's attacking them? Very much so. And so from that perspective, things have not changed in the way that man's empires work. But these empires have a flaw, and that flaw was in the feet. Now we've got it. There's lots of details we could look on that, but I think one of the main things about the flaw in the feet was it was not united. It was something that didn't hold together. Empires of the world don't hold together, and I think the idea is that they don't hold together because they don't have a common bond or purpose. They have man's purpose, but they don't hold together. Of course, in the last thing in the second chapter was we had this great stone. And it's obviously by God because no man was involved in it. It came, it rolled down, and it overcame the empires of the world and filled the world. It's never going to be replaced. Empires of the world replace one right after another, right through time. But this will never be replaced. And one idea I suggested last week, and I think it's extremely important for us, not that it just destroyed the empires of the world, it replaced them with that which is perfect, rather than that which was flawed. And I think that which is perfect is a unity that comes from God. That's what we have in the empire of God. That's what draws us to it, is the unity that we can have with God and we can have with one another. And the way I see that, how it supersedes all the empires of the world. Empires of the world are confined to their place. That's what Putin is trying to do. He's trying to expand his place right now so he can control more of the world. But we have next to him, China's an empire, and they're confined to their place. They'd have their boundaries. But the kingdom of God is not defined by place. How do I know that? Thinking about this here, I know Christians from Ukraine. I know them in Moldova. Eddie knows them in Bulgaria, in China, in Africa. We know some. Some even know them in Australia. We know Christians that are brothers all around the world, and we are brothers with them. That is not dependent upon place, but it's dependent upon our unity in God. And I think that's the point of this chapter 12 here, is that man's empires are always going to fail. They're evil, they're frightening, they're big, they're intimidating, but they are going to come down because they don't have the unity. It's based on man's purposes and man's ideas, and not based on the unity that comes from God. The reason we can be united across land is because it's based on relationships based upon God and not based on man's relationships. And I think that's, to me, that deserves a lot more study and a lot more thought than what I can give it in a class. But I do think I just present that as an idea for you to think about and go on. I know there's a lot of details that we haven't covered. Now, what I want us to do now is get to the last part. We didn't talk about this last Sunday night. I said all that to get to these two verses. Nebuchadnezzar is impressed greatly with Daniel's interpretation of the dream. The reason he's impressed with the interpretation of the dream is because of the miracle that is performed before he interprets the dream. And what was the miracle? What the dream was. Nebuchadnezzar kept that a secret. That was his test. Remember, he told the wise men, if I tell you what the dream is, you're going to make up some kind of a story that's way down the road after I'm gone, and I'll never know if it's true or not. But if you can tell me what the dream was, and then I will believe you when you tell me what it means. Well, that's where he is at the end of this after he has met Daniel. And Daniel has told him what the dream was. And he says, now here's what it means. In verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. And the king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries. For you've been able to reveal this mystery. And then he gives Daniel high honors. I want us just to focus on that idea. Nebuchadnezzar now begins to observe something about God. Now we're going to see as we go forward, Nebuchadnezzar hadn't got it all yet because he's going to make some real blunders in the next couple of chapters. But he was able to witness this miracle of having the dream revealed and the interpretation and come to the conclusion, yes, there is somebody that is greater than I am. To me, that proves who is ruler. Is it Nebuchadnezzar? Or, as he says, your God is God of gods, Lord of kings, revealer of mysteries. He is greater than Nebuchadnezzar. And that answers the question of who is ruler? God is ruler. Who is wise? God is wise. And so that, to me, that's what I think I see in that chapter. It shows that men's empires, as much as they try to control and be the solution for people's lives, they are always going to fail. Now, that has a lot of implications for us. I know growing up, I always heard the term and that this was a Christian nation we live in. Now the things have gotten so bad here, most people don't say that. But the only Christian nation is a nation that Jesus Christ established. These other nations are men's empires, and we do not need to allow to think that they are going to control our life or there's a solution to our life's problems. Only God's kingdom contains a solution to our life's problems. And I think that's one application for us today in our lives with this message here. Eddie?
These two verses you focused on, there's something that really jumps out at me on that. First, Daniel did a very good job of explaining that it's not me, but it is my God who does this. And then Nebuchadnezzar does a good job of accepting that.
Right.
In contrast to what we'll see in chapter 5, where Belteshazzar doesn't get it at all.
Okay, very good. Nebuchadnezzar going to get another chance at this too. Okay, thank you. And anything else on chapter 2? I know there's lots that we could say and look at there, but I want to cover chapter 3 tonight if we could. Now, I'm convinced that the first 5 chapters are very tight, or the whole book is very tightly, but to me, the first 5 chapters have this theme that rolls from chapter to chapter to chapter. The first chapter we looked at, allegiance to God. Here we see world empires versus God's empire, which we're going to have allegiance to. This next chapter is going to be a test of allegiance to God, is what chapter 3 is going to be about. So let's turn to chapter 3. In the first 7 verses, chapter 3, let's read those and look. As you go through that, we're going to look at some of these things, the great image, everybody's gathered in music and in the command and everybody falling down. Says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you're to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Okay, a lot of repetition there, but I think that's there for a purpose. What do we have going on here? We just came from chapter 2, and there was this great image, which we see that represents the empires of the world. Now, I don't know how long the events of chapter 2 were time-wise, or chapter 3 time-wise, were after chapter 2. But Daniel records chapter 3 right after chapter 2. And I think there's some connection here. Is Nebuchadnezzar trying to build something that has been prompted by his vision that represents him and his empire and wanting the people to fall down and serve that? Is Nebuchadnezzar trying to unite the people behind his empire? Is that what he's trying to do? Because I think it says, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. Nebuchadnezzar has brought people from the nations, from that speak different languages. He's brought them captive to Babylon. We know in the first chapter, he was trying to make them Babylonians. It appears that he is trying to create unity to his empire with this great image. Now, he associates it with his God, and we see it's very directly associated with his authority as king, because when we get down here to verse 15, when he talks to the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? This is my authority. This is my image. Even though it represents my God, it's me and my authority. So it's Nebuchadnezzar's rule that is at stake here, and his authority that's at stake, and his prestige and his pride seems to be what this 90-foot tall, this ceiling to here, 18 or 20 feet. You go out back and stand at the back of the building and look up, that might be 45 feet from the ground all the way up. 9-story building. That's a pretty big. Would that be intimidating and impressive? That kind of lets you know what Nebuchadnezzar thought about himself and his rule, and that everybody was subject to him, and he was trying. I think this is one of the seeds of men. He's sowing this seed to unite everybody under him because of his greatness, his power, and he expects everybody to unite under him. We read all these people here. What do you think the writer Daniel is doing here when he starts naming all these categories of people? That seems to me to be a literary technique to get it, rather than saying just everybody, he names everybody, all groups of people. So this is universal in his kingdom, that he's trying to get everybody show homage or allegiance to him through worshiping this great statue. Now, that's I think is a problem we saw back over in chapter 2. Here we see a demonstration of that problem, I think, in chapter 3 with Nebuchadnezzar, trying to get people to fall down and submit to him. Now, what's the problem with that?
Like what our mother would tell us, if everybody else shows off a bridge, would you go with them?
Right, okay. He's not God. He's not the ruler. God is the ruler. Him only shall we serve. That's not to say that we don't give government the authority that's due them, but Nebuchadnezzar is placing himself and his directive in the place of God, is what he's doing here. And of course, that's going to cause a problem for them. So I think that's the first thing we see. He's placing himself, his directive in the place of God, and he's using that to unite everybody under him. Seems to be what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here. Okay, now, of course, immediately we understand that this is going to cause a problem. It says, for this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews, maybe jealous Chaldeans. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the Trajan, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music does fall down and worship you. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, back to chapter 1, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, had disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you set up. You got these foreigners you brought in here. You think they're wise, and you put them over the kingdom, and they're not even smart enough to bow down to your idol, your image, to show allegiance to you. They won't do that. As I say, I think it's probably jealousy because we remember chapter 1, the things that were going on there. So this is the charge that is brought against them. Nebuchadnezzar, being true to his character, we see in 13 here, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? So Nebuchadnezzar in rage. Why do you suppose he's in a rage? Pardon? He's been humiliated. There's somebody that does not submit themselves to him. And he is at the pinnacle. He's got this 90-foot tall image, and some have suggested that image was a characteristic of him. At least it represents his pride, if nothing else. And somebody is not respecting his pride. And so he's in a rage. He is also quite impetuous, I would say here. Remember, he is ready at a moment's notice to execute punishment. Don't you notice that? He is quite the authoritarian, I guess we would say. He's not like our court system that extends bail and extends bail and extends bail. You either bow down now, the fire's ready. He's very quick with his punishment. Any thoughts on that? I like that question. What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? What's that suggest about Nebuchadnezzar's impression of himself? He's above God, right? Even a God cannot overcome me. So I think that's about as proud as you can get. Eddie?
The Chaldeans that came to him at the beginning, they emphasized the word disregard.
Right.
And I think that's what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. You're not going to disregard me.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm the authority. I'm God. Now, we're sure their motivation was jealousy because of their position, the way they stated that. Plus, they knew how to antagonize Nebuchadnezzar with their response to him. Yeah, and so they antagonized him. Yes, Dempsey. You have a problem. Yep.
And look at the kind of men you appointed. Did you know this is the way they think about you?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be easy for them, as in the first chapter, to exercise a situation atmosphere. Now, okay, we're away from home. Everybody else is doing this. Why don't we just do this one time? We know there's only one true God. What difference does it make? It would be easy for them to rationalize this situation here, but their faith holds true to God. And they've seen his wrath, they've seen his anger and what he will do, and that doesn't matter. We serve God, and that's the answer.
And that's why I think this book falls in the time it falls in, because there are some faithful Jews who are in a terrible circumstance, and God is trying to give them the strength and encouragement to stay with him, to let them know that Nebuchadnezzar is not God. Even though he thinks he is not God. Okay, other thoughts? Would you say Nebuchadnezzar is a slow learner? Yeah, like you say. He's contradicting himself here, isn't he, from what he had said in chapter 2. And I think we often do that sometimes. We contradict ourselves. I want us to look at 16 through 18, because I think this is the most important 3 verses in this chapter. These are the verses of conviction. This is, other than Jesus' statement of faith in the Garden of Eden, I personally think this is the greatest statement of faith in all the Bible. This one here. You might disagree with that, but here we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter." Think about that. It's not negotiable, Nebuchadnezzar. We are where we are on this. We've done what we have done, and it's not going to change. We don't need to discuss. It's, you're offering us this option, fall down and worship you. Well, it's not negotiable. We're serving God. We're not worshiping your idol. I think they do it politely, they do it firmly, and they do it based on conviction. Now, that's faith. Now, they did it truly realizing the consequences, as we see in the next verse. If it be so that our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And it's easy for us we pray that part of it sometimes. We have a difficulty or a trial. We say, "Oh God, please deliver us," and then we quit praying. They truly realized that there was a real chance of bodily harm here. They have totally given themselves to God here. But even if he does not, at first it says, if he's able, he will. Here he says, if he chooses not to, even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, they are convinced that they're going to serve Jehovah God, and it's not negotiable with them. Our problem too many times is it's negotiable. How far can I go? How close can I go that way? What can I give up and still stick with it? They said, it's here. We're not going to serve. It doesn't make any difference if God is going to save us or if he is not going to save us. We're not going to worship your image. They have totally given themselves to God. And as far as they were concerned, they were as good as dead whenever they made this statement. Charlie?
Why Daniel was mentioned with these three brothers?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, Charlie. I don't know. But I have a couple of speculations. You can always speculate. These three guys were set immediately over top of the rest of these satraps. They were their immediate supervisors. Daniel was given a position somewhere else in the king's court. So I suspect they had a personal grievance against these three guys. That's my guess. And Daniel was not implicated. Now, we're convinced that Daniel didn't, because a very similar thing is going to happen to Daniel in the 6th chapter when we get to the lion's den. It's a very similar thing, and they're not included in that one. But that's the best speculation I can give you on that it was a personal grievance with these three guys that were their immediate supervisors.
You know, my thought on that was Daniel had just given the king the interpretation of the dream. And, you know, instead of trying to pick out the top guy, pick out some of the others.
That may be true. Yeah, that's.
You know, because he really saved most of them. He said, don't kill them. And I think if they come in and said, you need to kill Daniel too, I would say, well, been nice on me.
Yeah, but he had already forgot who was the God of gods, hadn't he? Yeah. So he could have been away. They could have not, because Daniel was next to the king, so he could have had business other places in the empire. But I do think the suggestion is there, he is trying to draw everybody together in the empire. He names all this category of people, all nations and tongues. This is how he's going to control that empire, is their allegiance. They're submitting to him by bowing down to the statue. And we see the same thing in the New Testament with the Caesars and all through that. It's by bowing down and giving homage to the governing authorities. It's a way of showing allegiance to them. But our allegiance is to God. And I think that's really important for us as people today. Our allegiance is to God. Now, we serve as citizens of the country, but our allegiance is to God.
This story would have spread very quickly among the Jews. Soon the Jews all over would have heard, what happened here, and this would have been a rally cry for them.
Right.
That our God has not abandoned us. He has not abandoned. He's still with us. We must trust in him. And they trusted in God. God has not abandoned them, even though they're in captivity. God, they're still his people, his covenant people. The idea of allegiance, I believe that's a large part of the oppression that the end of these other kingdoms. Christ's kingdom is number one to us. Our allegiance is first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And no matter what our king or president, our ruler says, what Christ says, King Jesus is number one to us. And so he is overall. And I think that's an example of that.
And that's because he serves for honorable and holy purposes. Kingdoms of the world serve for selfish purposes. But our allegiance is to God because he is God. Okay. But I do think this is one of the greatest statements of faith in the entire Bible. We don't need to negotiate that with you, King. Yes, Mike.
I agree that it's a great statement of faith, and one of the things that I think it teaches us about how we should pray, because when they say, there in verse 16, you know, they were verse 17 actually, our God is able to deliver us from the burning fire burns. That's the first thing he is able to. And then they go on and say, and he will deliver us out of that hand of the king. And then they kind of walk back that second part of it. They say, but if not, be it known unto thee. So they understand that God doesn't have to save them from the furnace.
Right.
They start to sound like they're saying, oh, he's going to save us. Oh, but maybe he won't. If he doesn't, that's okay too. We're still not going to obey him. But they never walked back that first statement where they said God is able to save us. And we talked about how when we pray, we should have faith. When we ask God for things, we should have faith in God. A lot of times someone's sick and we want to pray for their healing. We're like, we don't really believe God's going to heal them. It feels like we have a lack of faith. Our faith needs to be like these three men's faith. It's not faith that God is bound to protect us.
Right.
But what we have to have complete faith in is that God is able to do those things. He is able to protect us. He is able to deliver us. He is able to heal us. He's not bound to that, and maybe he won't. And even if he doesn't, it's still going to be okay. It's still going to hurt him. But we have to believe that he is able to.
I think I really appreciate you pointing that out, Mike, because I think that's essential in our prayers, essential in our understanding, because if we don't have that understanding, that contrast that's made there, we're going to lose our faith. If we think God is bound to give us what we pray for, and sometimes we're not going to get it. Now, we've got a lot of the ladies that were announced this morning, we've got a lot of very sick ladies in this congregation. And we've just had, some people die. And we've been praying for those people. But that doesn't mean that God is bound to give us what we're praying for. But he is able and he can, but he may choose that that's not what he's going to deliver because of his infinite wisdom is greater than I really appreciate you pointing that. That's an important point for us. Because if we don't see it from that perspective, we're going to destroy our faith.
Not only that, it's important to be totally capable and will do something a little more difficult than dealing with that.
Right. Yes. And that's the ultimate bottom line of Daniel. Is our king is everlasting. His kingdom is everlasting. And even if these fellows got burned up in the fire, they were still going to trust their God because they knew he would save them. So they have as good as give their bodies to the fire, is what they at this time. So poor old Nebuchadnezzar, then we go down to the next verse here. He's filled with wrath. He was rage before, wrath now, which seems to be greater intensity, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It seems that he loses all control of himself, is the idea. He becomes full of wrath and he just completely loses control. Is he the one we want to be following? The one that can't control his emotions, can't control his thinking, his words? But that's the idea. He's full of wrath and he loses control. And he gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than is usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace had been made extremely hot. The flame of fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. We have some of this repetition here, their trousers and all these things. They were completely dressed. They tied them up and threw them in. There's 2 or 3 things I want us to observe about this. Of course, he's in a rage. Says he heats the furnace 7 times harder. I think that's probably just means completely hotter than it had ever been. And it shows his complete disregard, not only for these three men's life, but the life of his most valiant soldiers. Wrath causes a complete disregard for human life. Putin has completely got a disregard for the human life of people. If anything we read on the news is close to being correct, whether it be hospitals, babies, orphanages, he doesn't care. That's where Nebuchadnezzar was at this time. He didn't care. He was going to execute his wrath. And so human life meant nothing to him, so that he would kill these three and kill his soldiers. Yes.
Along with that, I think that's why in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus starts talking about the surpassing righteousness, he begins with the idea of murder being equated with hate.
Okay.
And I think that's what we see here, is it is intense hatred because he lost control of the situation, so he lost control of himself. And he ends up murdering people, or at least attempting to murder people.
Well, he does end up murdering his soldiers.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good thoughts. Okay, anything else? Right. Yeah. Once you lose control, it's over. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts there? We'll try to finish this up here before we get done. So we'll go down. Then Nebuchadnezzar king was astounded and stood up in haste, and he said to his officials, "Was it not three men we cast into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." And he said, "Look, I see four men loose and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." What does son of the gods look like? How did Nebuchadnezzar or his wise men know what a son of the gods looked like?
It looks somewhat different and glorious than regular people.
Okay, probably. Now, I don't know how in the blaze of fire what more glory is going to look like, but there's one individual in there that doesn't look like the other three. And he doesn't look like any of the guys that threw him in. He's got some special superhuman quality about him. So like Moses, when he came off the mountain, his face glowed. There's something glorious about that one in there. So it's the only way they could explain it is this one's equated to be with the gods. And of course, there's lots of discussion and speculation, but we think that very well could have been Jesus there in the furnace with them, just as the rock. This is God saving them. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire and responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, your servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on their bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. I don't know if any of you have ever gone out with a campfire and burned a little wood in the campfire. You got to take a shower to get the smell of smoke off of you, right? Most of us have done that. These guys came out of a furnace of fire, and they don't even have the hair singed on their head, not even the smell of smoke on them. Now, this is obviously another miracle. It's the only way you can explain that, because the men that threw them in, they died on the ramp to the top of the furnace. And these fellows walk out the front opening of the furnace unscathed and unharmed. God was with them in the furnace, is the picture here. Yes.
That word that's translated effect in the New American Standard, I've got a note in my Bible, says literally means power.
Okay.
The fire had no power over them.
Okay. Yeah, because we're expecting them to burn them up, because the fire killed the other fellows, but it had no power on them. Very good. Pardon? Yeah. And the binding is gone. Okay. A tremendous miracle has occurred here. As if any miracle is not tremendous. All miracles are tremendous. Now we're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's response. I think we're going to see through these various chapters that Nebuchadnezzar's faith grows a little bit with each evidence that he gives. Now he's got a long way to go, and he slides back often. I see his faith growing just a little bit each time. Verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any God except their God. Therefore, I'm making a decree that any people, nation, tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubble heap. Inasmuch as there is no other God that is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. A couple of things, and at least he acknowledges that their God is capable. It was undeniable at this point in time. I like that statement that they yielded up their bodies. They said, "O king, there's no negotiation here. Throw us in. We're willing to go in." They have yielded their bodies up rather than to, isn't that the idea of Christ when he died on the cross? There was no negotiation. He yielded himself to the death on the cross. This is kind of a prefiguring of that. Faith in God, yielding your bodies to serve God. Then poor old Nebuchadnezzar just cannot keep from being abrasive and harsh. Now he turns from wanting to burn somebody in a furnace. If they don't agree with this proclamation, we're going to destroy their houses and turn them into a rubbish heap. And they're going to be torn limb from limb. So everything he does is extreme. He doesn't, he's going, if you don't listen to this command, then you're going to get this punishment. And it's all immediate and extreme. So how would you like to have worked for Nebuchadnezzar? If he got up on the wrong side of the bed and you were serving him his morning coffee, I doubt he drank coffee, but his morning drink, and you spilled it on his robe, where do you think you might end up? In a rubbish heap, right? He was a tyrant. And showing, again, I think, he's trying to show us the extreme nature of empires that we have to deal with and leaders that we have to deal with. They are not going to be people that follow God. They're going to be self-willed, and they're going to do what they want to do, yet we still have to follow God in the face of that. Okay, that's all I've got for us tonight. Some other thoughts before we close out our class tonight. So what I see in this chapter is Nebuchadnezzar is a demonstration of the arrogant empires we saw in chapter 2. These failing empires. Nebuchadnezzar is now a real life demonstration of that, one who is trying to promote its unity and itself by man's means rather than the unity that comes from God. And that, we can't succumb to that like they didn't, and we still have to trust in God, even though we have to yield up our bodies to suffering. Okay. Thank you all. We'll take up with chapter 4 next week. We'll see Nebuchadnezzar is still having problems learning. We'll get to chapter 4. Okay, let's have a word of prayer then. Brian Crawley, would you lead us in a prayer?
Father in heaven, we ask that you bless us as we read this evening and help us to take the words of this study into our hearts and we found this week to be men and women of faith, just as these we have read about from the book of James. We thank you for sending us your son Jesus, for whom we can see forgiveness of our sins. And we pray